Minneapolis officer, Minneapolis.
Use
Minneapolis officer.
Officer. Minneapolis officer.
Is
Minneapolis officer.
Yes.
Officer. Minneapolis officer.
officer.
Yes. Officer. Minneapolis officer. Minneapolis officer.
Is Minneapolis.
Officer.
Minneapolis.
Occasion. Officer.
Body.
Officer. Minneapolis.
Correct.
Minneapolis.
Body.
Officer. Body. Minneapolis officer.
Yes, that is correct.
Officer.
News.
Minneapolis.
Minneapolis officer.
Body.
Officer. Minneapolis. A time.
Correct.
Officer. Body of a son officer. Officer. Body. Minneapolis. Body. Use. Minneapolis. Officer.
Body.
Minneapolis officer. Minneapolis officer. Minneapolis officer. Body. The Minneapolis body. Minneapolis officer. Body. Automatic. Body. Minneapolis officer. Body. Minneapolis officer. Body. Used. Minneapolis. Ins officer. Body. Officer. Use. Officer. Body. Officer.
Minneapolis officer,
Officer.
Minneapolis police body.
Officer. Just a Minneapolis officer. Minneapolis. The Minneapolis officer. Minneapolis officer. Minneapolis.
Body. Yeah.
Minneapolis officer, Minneapolis
officer.
News.
Minneapolis officer.
Officer.
Ins body. Minneapolis officer.
Can you use?